Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the moment of truth. When it comes to propaganda, the white media reigns supreme, and the last few days they've been putting on a clinic of how to protect white power. First, they hoped that the video of Dana White beating his wife wouldn't be seen by too many folks, but it was. Then, when it became public, the white media took Dana White's side. When he gave his phony baloney apology, the white media cheerfully accepted it and didn't even question it. They cast no aspersions on his apology. They didn't say anything was duplicitous about it or insincere. The exact opposite of what they did to Ray Rice and every other black man who they've accused of harming a woman. None of them are demanding an interview with Dana White's wife either. None of them are asking if any female employees at the UFC have been mistreated or otherwise done wrong by Dana White. They're completely disinterested in the biggest combat sports promotion on the planet, a billion-dollar company that they have been fawning breathlessly over for years, and whose boss was caught on video beating his wife in public. In fact, the white media has already begun the process of trying to turn the page on this little scandal. Genetic immunity from law must be maintained, after all, though at least one white media reporter has publicly admitted that the white media outlets told their employees not to write anything bad about Dana White, because when ESPN says don't write anything inflammatory about him, well, at a time like this, writing anything about Dana White would be inflammatory, so what they're saying is don't write anything about him at all. This is how the white media operates. They don't report, they repeat whatever white power tells them to say. Their job is to push a narrative, and when the person being accused of wrongdoing is white, the pattern is ignore it, pretend it didn't happen, and if ignoring it doesn't work, then downplay it. If downplaying it doesn't work, then say that there's nothing that can be done about it and you need to move on, and if people refuse to move on, then the white media will justify whatever that person did. You have a reporter for ESPN who has publicly stated that they've been told hands off Dana White. So this confirms that there is a racial policy in place where ESPN and the rest of the white media's coverage is concerned. They're not about to do anything that could contribute to a feeding frenzy against Dana White. Oh no, they're not going to sensationalize this. We need to go ahead and bury it. And that also goes for the boss of UFC, the real boss, Ari Emanuel, who is still in hiding as of this posting. Ari Emanuel hasn't been seen nor heard from since last week on anything. He hasn't said a word to anybody, and the white media is not trying to track down his whereabouts either. And it's not fear of Ari Emanuel or his formerly fearsome reputation that's keeping the white media from doing their jobs. It's that Ari Emanuel isn't black. And the purpose of the white media is to push an anti-black racial narrative. This is a mutual protection racket going on here. One hand washing the other. So Ari Emanuel gets the same hands-off treatment that Dana White is getting from the white media, but now we're seeing what appears to be an effort by the white media to limit the fallout from this. Because they're seeing that this story just isn't being allowed to die. The public's just not letting it go. So they're trying to put in place a plan B just in case they're not able to keep Dana White from going down. The strategy now seems to be to create a firewall between Dana White and Ari Emanuel. Right now, they're trying to pretend as if Dana White's scandal of beating his wife has nothing to do with Ari Emanuel. These two are two completely separate entities, and that even if Dana White is on the hot seat, well, nothing Dana White has done, including damaging Endeavor's stock price, has anything to do with Ari Emanuel. And in fact, the public's not mad at Ari Emanuel at all. There's no public anger against him, so people need to accept that. At least, that's the narrative that we see the white media trying to push. Variety has taken point on this one. Like the rest of the white media, they know exactly how their silence on this story looks. They know exactly how bad it makes them look, how biased it makes them look. The truth is coming out. So what they're doing is they're running a CYA story which admits that Ari Emanuel's refusal to say anything about the Dana White wife-beating video is raising eyebrows in Hollywood. Now that's a masterpiece of minimalization right there. With a headline like that, you're supposed to think that Variety is actually looking at Ari Emanuel and asking tough questions about him, starting with when will he resign since his business partner beat his wife and Emanuel chose to go into hiding rather than deal with it. But that's not what's going on here at all. And they're not making any sort of noises saying that what Ari Emanuel is doing is basically amounting to a cover-up after the fact. In fact, the closest that this Variety piece came to holding Ari Emanuel to account was a one-and-done blink-and-you'll-miss-it mention of Emanuel's hypocritical op-eds attacking Kanye West. Except this piece doesn't use the word hypocrisy. Instead, they decided to use one time the phrase double standard. That's as close as they were willing to get to mentioning the word hypocrisy in this piece. What Ari Emanuel did wasn't merely a double standard. He's being called out precisely because of his hypocrisy. He said one thing when it came to Kanye West and Kyrie Irving and Dave Chappelle, but he's doing exactly the opposite when it comes to Dana White and himself. When a weasel like Ari Emanuel gets on a high horse and attacks every high-profile black man he can under the guise of how it's imperative that everyone speak up when there's offensive speech, but then a few weeks later he goes into hiding when his business partner's caught on video beating his wife, the first word we're supposed to be seeing is the word hypocrisy in the headline. Instead, all we're seeing is eyebrows are raised and double standard. But the real topper came later in the article when the author wrote, "But in the case of White, there has been little public clamoring for Emanuel to address the violence." That's weasel words. Acting as if people are not making it a point to mention Ari Emanuel's name means that he's not on the hot seat. That's what they're trying to say. No public clamoring, this writer claims. Well, let me show you some of the public clamoring that this Tatiana Siegel person claims isn't happening. Last week, Deadline ran the first piece asking if Ari Emanuel can afford to stay quiet with his buddy having been caught beating his wife on video. Then The Guardian ran a story saying it's time for UFC to consider going on without Dana White. 3 days ago, NBA player Kyle Kuzma posted on Twitter that ESPN's coverage, or lack thereof, of Dana White's wife beating was an embarrassment. And then he followed up by asking the white sports media in general, why do they pick and choose when to blast people? And he put Dana White's name with question marks. Now, those 2 tweets alone have been viewed nearly 5 million times. Almost 5 million views of those 2 tweets, but apparently Tatiana Siegel and the rest of the white media missed that somehow. Now, 5 million tweets is not viral, that's mega viral. A lot of people have seen this. The white media routinely calls things with far, far less views viral, so how the heck did they miss this one? This is an NBA player calling out ESPN. How is that not headline news when millions and millions of people have seen it? Because the white media, as that ESPN reporter tweeted, is trying to bury this. But the public clamoring didn't stop there. On his Instagram, D.L. Hughley, of all people, called out the white media's obvious refusal to cover this story, saying if that had been a brother, it'd be nonstop coverage, dredging up a playground fight from the 3rd grade, scouring old tweets, you name it. Where are the salacious headlines? Where's the pressure? Oh, he apologized. Hashtag white privilege. And then Jamie Foxx posted a reply saying, effing preach. So it's not just Ari Emanuel's hypocrisy that's being called out, it's the white media's too. That's the reason why they need to be burying this. Going in on Ari Emanuel, well, a lot of people are going to be pointing and going, well, weren't you guys just trying to just bury this and get rid of it? Oh, now you're reporting on it. Yeah, because the rest of the public won't let it die. You have celebrities piling on Dana White, all these people assailing him, but the white media is not doing any headlines about that. And remember, ESPN is part of the Disney empire, so when you see someone saying ESPN network's trying to avoid saying anything about Dana White beating his wife, that also means the same policy goes for ABC as well. But since that reporter's tweet came out, ESPN has been forced to do a CYA piece of their own. It's about the California Legislative Women's Caucus writing a letter to Ari Emanuel demanding that he fire his buddy and business partner. And the Women's Caucus letter also mentions Emanuel's silence on this violent incident, calling his silence piercing and troubling. So you have white media outlets on both sides of the Atlantic, as well as celebrities and athletes demanding Dana White be punished. But look at how this Tatiana Siegel woman chose to phrase it. She didn't say there wasn't public clamoring for Dana White to be punished. She said there wasn't public clamoring for Ari Emanuel to address it. Now, taken literally, this piece is falsely claiming that the public isn't demanding that anything be done to punish Dana White. But there's also a second meaning to this statement that I think is equally obvious. If and when Ari Emanuel ever crawls out of whatever hole he's hiding in right now, no one will care that he refused to do anything about a woman beater. At least that's what this puff piece will want to try to mislead you into believing. Why, there's no public clamoring for Ari Emanuel to address it. He has every right to be quiet about it. That's not going to hurt him. His silence doesn't equal violence, and it certainly isn't a detriment to him, because, where's the public clamoring against him? It's ridiculous to pretend that there's no clamoring for White to be punished or for Ari Emanuel to do it. Keep in mind, there was no clamoring for Kyrie Irving to be persecuted, no demonstrations against him. As I've documented here, there were huge demonstrations in support of Kyrie Irving, but there was no public clamoring for Kyrie Irving to be punished in any way. But you have some very rich and very influential people, white power's elite, who wanted to see Kyrie Irving be dragged. And these are the exact same people who decide what you see on TV and what kind of headlines you see and what those headlines say. The same people who tell ESPN not to write certain stories. This Siegel woman is a clown. You have part of the California legislature calling Ari Emanuel out by name, but apparently to Tatiana Siegel, that doesn't count as public outrage against Ari Emanuel. So the duly elected representatives of the people of California don't count as public outrage? Since the story isn't going away and Ari Emanuel's attempt to hide from it has only put more attention on himself, the white media's goal now is to insulate Ari from punishment. How many times has the white media reported on some high-profile incident at a company or some big-name personality getting themselves in hot water and then asking when their bosses will have to be forced to resign? They do it regularly. Whenever there's some big scandal, not only does the employee who did it have to go, but they look and go, well, the boss has to go too. You couldn't control your subordinates, you got to go too. Well, in this case, you got the head of the company who's done wrong. And the person who's over him happens to be one of his buddies and his business partners, and yet the white media is sitting here saying there's no public clamoring for anything to be done. And even if there is, nobody's angry at Ari Emanuel, nobody's cross at him. This article reads like it was written, or at least heavily edited, by Ari Emanuel and his pals over at Endeavor. This article is not merely an attempt to try to separate Ari Emanuel from Dana White's wrongdoing. It's also an attempt to try to separate Ari Emanuel from what should be the punishment for his own silence in the face of this scandal. The writing's on the wall. Even Ari Emanuel and the rest of the white media can see it. Every day that goes by, the chances are increasing that Dana White won't be able to simply ride out this storm. Ari's own attempts to lay low and wait out the public clamor isn't working either. What Ari Emanuel wants is to make sure that if Dana White goes down, at least he doesn't take Ari with him. When you have ESPN saying don't write anything inflammatory about Dana White, you can bet that edict was probably due to pressure from Ari Emanuel. And stories like this smell like more of the same. So don't be fooled by what this undercover puff piece tries to convince you of. As Dr. Noam Chomsky said, the highest form of propaganda is when something presents itself as opposition, when in reality it's actually support. This article tried to present itself as wagging its finger at Ari Emanuel. It was going to be calling out the fact that he is not saying anything, and instead, what did you get? You got a full-throated defense of Ari Emanuel. They even took out the time to lie and claim that, well, nobody's really clamoring for Dana White to be punished either. Sure, you just have major athletes, entertainers, and the California legislature saying it's not okay that Dana White's not being punished, and that the white media is not giving this the attention that they would if Dana White was black. But we all know why that is. The white media's job is to be the primary cheerleaders for white power and its primary defender. Well, we're going to make sure that people still hear about this. Tatiana Siegel can pretend that nobody's thinking about Dana White or Ari Emanuel, but the reality is we're thinking about both of them. And we're also thinking about these white media writers like Tatiana Siegel, who are the main ones who demonize and attack black men relentlessly over rumors, gossip, innuendo, making sure that any time they mention a black person, it's always negative, and who now have tried to ignore this scandal. And having failed that, they're now trying to minimize it. This is the white media's most important narrative that's at stake. They saw what happened when we shot down the white media's narrative that they used to try to defend the police when they kill all these black people. We're not going to let the white media use any weasel words to confuse the issue. The last time they tried that ploy was when Mike Bloomberg ran for president. They claimed that stop and frisk hadn't hurt Bloomberg's standing with black voters at all. And then, a few weeks later, black voters humiliated Bloomberg in a church, and he was forced to drop out of the race a couple of days later. And as for the white media, they were forced to admit that stop and frisk was what ran him out of the race. What you're seeing here with the white media trying to run interference for Ari Emanuel, this is a variation on the exact same theme. They see that the house of cards is in danger of crashing down. They see that this creep Emanuel is hanging in there by his fingertips. That is, if he can't make this go away. So that's why we're seeing these stories, meant to push the narrative that there's nothing to see here. The white media already knows full well that they're lying. What they don't know is whether or not you're falling for it. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Emily, David Green, R. Laz, Jacques Hargett, and G. Mars. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.